first thing I'm gonna do is some caveats about how this one session today is a little different than what we usually do. But then we're gonna focus, the gist of this is how to increase your user engagement. Who is your user? And I'm gonna talk about two personas of user and give you ideas for engaging in each type of user. For each type of user, we're going to talk about a communication plan, and we're going to talk about a training plan, and then a brief focus on setting goals, measuring progress, and then I'll show you two scenarios. And then we'll end with some thoughts on why is it so hard to get user engagement. I have some thoughts on that after I've been at IData now for almost 4 years. And I do have some thoughts on why it is so difficult. It's legitimate that it is hard. It's not about, well, we'll talk about that when we get there. So, as Jim said early on, today's session is not heavy feature focused on Data Cookbook. It's a conversation, and it's more thoughts and ideas. You would take the ideas that you're going to hear about today and create an action plan for yourself. Engaging users is a process, and so you need a plan for it, and one plan size does not fit all. I will give you some frameworks for a plan, but you will take that and create something that suits your situation, that satisfies your stakeholders, and that works at a pace that your institution can sustain. I am presenting a kaleidoscope of things. It's a broad brushstroke. You would not do all of the things that I recommend today. You set yourself a roadmap, you cherry pick the pieces that are relevant and that you can do, and then you move on from there. It's not expected that you do all of this. Conversely, if you're sitting there thinking, as I start to show some things, thinking, well, I could never do that, or that we're never going to get that. Well, back off of that, and what are the smaller steps that you could take to move towards that goal? So the understanding is that you can do something, but you will not need to do everything. So who are the user types? I've identified two simple ones. One is the end consumer. In my training, I often refer to her as Connie Sumer. And she does not provide content or approve content in Data Cookbook. She enjoys the benefits of all that approved content. The second user type is a content provider, a data steward or a report writer. The roles that they play in an institution could be registrar. Do I have a typo there? No, registrar. A bursar, institutional research manager, report writers, or people who manage report writers, people who actively engage, they participate in the workflow. There's a difference in these two types of users, Data Cookbook users. Connie Sumers, there are probably, if you're a small school, maybe you have a couple, maybe you have 100. As you get larger, you quickly can have a couple hundred, and if you are a large university, you might be pushing 1,000 users at some point. Content providers, that audience is smaller. I think even in a large school, it might not cap much above 50, maybe up to 100, but typically the workflow participants are somewhere between 20 and 40 people are participating. Big difference in scale in those two numbers, and that is the main driver. That scale is one of the main differentiators that I took when I outlined how I would approach engaging in each of these user types. So I'm going to take each one first. I'll take Connie Sumer, our fictitious Connie Sumer first, and I'll run through communication and training for her, and then I'll run through a content provider scenario with communication and training program for that role. So for balancing between communication and training, for the Connie Sumers, for the data consumers, you're going to be heavier on communication and lower on training information. More detail on who consumer might be. So recipients of budget reports, that's where your number can sometimes quickly run up into the hundreds of people who receive routine budget reports on a quarterly or monthly, maybe weekly basis. Academic folks, department chairs, different various assistant deans and associate deans. The provost would be on this consumer track. Student advisors and people like student advisors who are providing a service for students or in support of the teaching and learning enterprise, library staff perhaps, coaches. So these are folks who have day jobs. They need data and they want data to support the operational decisions that they are making within their area. They will never work with data full time and they don't want to. And our goal is to create a self-service informative environment that they can self-serve and utilize data effectively. So that's a little bit on who consumer is and that role, what that role is. Let's talk about some communication, both methods and what you would content. Methods are, think of them as methods or objects that you would use as your channel. So in terms of communication, an opt-in email service where if that person is interested in hearing from you about data related things, they do have a place where they can opt in. Recorded videos work well with this audience because of their contained nature and the ability to self-serve that and run it at any time and run it, view it as a group. A web page that centralizes the services and the people that are behind your data program. Data Cookbook APIs, we'll see some examples of these a couple slides down. This is the only Data Cookbook feature that I am invoking today. The APIs allow you to publish your approved Data Cookbook content, definitions, and specifications directly into the consumer's data environment, so directly into their reporting environment. Next method to think about is someone else's newsletter. Both this point and the last one are focused on reaching the data consumers where they are. So rather than introduce a new newsletter or something new into their world, find out what they already have in their world, what they're already utilizing that's pertinent to their operational area, and see if you can get included as a spotlight or as an announcement in the communication channels that they are already consuming. So you piggyback rather than create your own. Same thing for the last point. Rather than calling a meeting on your turf and on your that comes from you, go to theirs. Attend their department meetings and join them in their environment, which signals to them that the bar to participate is going to be lower. So regardless of the method that you choose, what are you going to say or communicate? I think there's really only three pertinent things. Statistics. Those are very compelling to people. How many? How many definitions? How many definitions in my area? How many reports have you described? Is it 10 or is it 30? And then also communicate brief, 2, 3, 4 sentences at the most, descriptions of what is data governance, what is the role of a business glossary, what is the benefit to providing a description to a report when you deliver the report. Very brief explanations. Then the third content example is a use case or a story. Storytelling is extremely effective with this audience. And you would tailor the use case. You might have a single script, but you could tailor the details to it to the financial aid people, to the finance people. And in that use case story, you would convey what's the time saving, focus on how their work specifically benefits from utilizing your tool or the information that you want to share with them. Overall, your approach to this users group is meet them in their terms, in their context, and broaden that with your information. Seek to avoid creating new or looking separate from them. So those are two screenshots for the API. This is what the search box looks like when it does open up, and here's an example. I actually used Argos as a dashboard in the example, and how the specification would look populating, clicking through to that. So what kind of training would you provide to consumer? In general, again, we're not going to do much training. That's my philosophy, is you do not want to invest a lot of resources into the training of this user type. It doesn't scale. But some things that you might consider are existing ticket systems. Data Cookbook supports an information request ticket system and a report request ticket system. You want to pay attention to the permissions level that allows people to do this. Submitting an information request, you would not need to make any changes to your permissions to utilize that. Using the request process for other objects, requesting a report, requesting a change to a report, requesting a quality rule, you would need to provide at the minimum editor permission levels to that person through that user group. Typically, clients use the generic consumer is in a user group called all users, and typically that is view only across the database, across the Data Cookbook. So you would need to modify that and give editor permissions across the object type, particularly specifications, to allow them to request it. So there's a risk there. You have to rethink open up your permissioning a bit to utilize that. I flag the all users group because that is the users group that every single user lands upon creation of an account. There's no management needed on your part. Everybody just lands there and you don't have to touch them. So that's the permission level that you would most easily want to modify to accommodate using it as a request process. To have to move somebody from the all users group to another users group that did have editor permissions is probably a situation that you don't want to maintain. Again, for consumer, for all users, hundreds of users, it's not sustainable to maintain it. So that replacing ticketing systems may seem like a heavy lift. So consider integrating with existing ticket systems. Maybe your current ticket system remains the starting point, but the recipient of that request has been trained to turn to the Data Cookbook and initiate a workflow through Data Cookbook. Some work happens in Data Cookbook, and then when that is closed out, somebody returns back to, we'll call it ticket system A, and closes out the request there. So the user, consumer, using ticket system A that she already knows, the cookbook is kind of transparent to her, but it may help manage her request internally. An alternative is that ticket system A, the starting point is Data Cookbook. And in the Data Cookbook workflow, there is a point where someone goes to another ticket system B, and performs some work process that is monitored through that other ticket system. And when that finishes out, you manually return back to Data Cookbook and finish out the workflow in the cookbook and move that closure to the requester, to Connie. So it's like a shell. I think of it as a shell ticket system. I get it, it's a burden. There's a bit of duplication there in that, but it can be the bridge process that you need in order to go more completely in one direction or the other, to move from an existing ticket system into Data Cookbook, or to keep your existing ticket system, but start to habituate people, other people behind the scenes, to utilize Data Cookbook and start to get a record of, we'll just document your data through Data Cookbook in that method. So I grant you there can be a duplication of effort using the shell ticket system, but I think the payoff, you need to think of the bigger payoff of the benefits of that. Another training artifact to create is just a 5-minute video using software such as the GoToMeeting or the Zoom. So many of us now have webinar access to webinar and recording software platforms. It is the bar to create a self-recorded video is reachable now. Keep them short, and they can be very effective for self-service. Last 2 points are, whatever you're communicating to people, you want, in some ways, it's advice to say, do things in a way that avoids the need for training. Make it obvious, make it self-evident, so that training and instruction is not needed. That's more of a perspective you want to take after you create a plan for yourself. You want to review it after you've designed it, looking specifically for, is there a way I could make this simpler? Is there a way I could make this more self-evident? I think it's a valid, the Rorschach test to put your plan through at the end to check. There's a tendency to just complicate things as you design it. It happens by nature. So that last step is to go back and see, okay, now that I've really understand what my process is, look specifically for ways to simplify it and make it self-evident. All right, let's switch gears and talk about this content provider. So at this point, we're talking about the roles of the data steward, the report writer, perhaps a database manager. These are people who are going to be actively, that word actively, like the other people weren't active. These are people who are going to be using the workflows and participating in workflows and actually creating or editing content. Here, to me, the balance switches. There's a lot more training and there's less generic communication. The exposure that you're going to get with this group through the training is going to, I think, reduce the amount of general communication that is needed. So what methods, or I guess artifacts was the word I couldn't think of earlier. What methods or artifacts would you use? Well, I would have an email channel for this audience as well, and I would make it mandatory. I would know who those people in those roles were, and I would manually put them into an email list and manage that and approach it that way. They would also have a web page. It might be a different web page. This one might be an intranet page or just a separate page. I would consider a newsletter for this audience or an email digest, some type of regular, I would say maybe bi-weekly, certainly monthly digest of routine communication in their mailbox. I would have face-to-face meetings. I have seen town hall type meetings very effective, aside from procedural meetings to maybe go over specific Data Cookbook workshops. I didn't put workshops on here. But let's talk about town hall meetings, where the purpose of a town hall meeting is not really to get any work done specifically. It is to create community, people meet each other, people can, the good areas of content, as I get down at the bottom here in the content, what would you talk about at a town hall meeting? Well, have people do a round robin of what are they currently working on, and that'll surface their problems, and then any success stories that they have had. And through that conversation, you gain insight into their work and where the gaps might be in their knowledge or in how they're approaching things. Let's talk through the other types of content here. Stats for this audience as well. Same stats as I would use before, quote, numbers, how many. I would add speed as a stat to this audience. How fast are things moving through workflow? Does it take days or weeks to move stuff through? What is that number? Usage stats. This would be reporting to this content providers what the consumers are doing. How many people are logging in? How many people are looking at the content that they are working so hard on? The content providers often never meet the consumers, and so they need to be told, content providers need to be told, here is how the work you have put into here's how the work that you have put effort into is being utilized by people, by these dozens or hundreds of people. This audience would hear new Data Cookbook content features, new product features. I skipped over that. New content updates to this audience would be if a new data domain is coming on board, you would say, well, the facilities area increased by 100 definitions this month in the areas of blah, blah, blah. You just give a summary of new scope areas of content that have come online. New features, I mentioned that changes the Data Cookbook that IData puts out about how workflow works, or technical things in the Data Cookbook. And any other types of contents we talked about, share that, keep a list of problems. What's the priority of those problems? And of course, you're listening for success stories. I think the method, I think an obvious method I didn't list in that top list was of meeting types. You would have routine working meetings with these people. You may just be meeting with them, again, bi-weekly or monthly, to talk about actual cookbook content and what problems are they having, just giving that forum there for people to talk through their content problems. Oh, I didn't mention it because I considered that a training option. So through these regular face-to-face meetings, you are providing on the spur of the moment, on an ad hoc basis, tips and keeping that skill set sharp with folks. You would have a packet, an orientation packet. When somebody new will start, right? Every couple months, there's going to be turnover in this group. What's your action plan? You need to have like your emergency kit that you can quickly, certainly within a couple weeks of them starting in their new role, you are there to provide them with explanation of what their role is and how they can perform that role effectively. And you need to be consistent with that across different domains and different personality types. You need to have a job description for the role itself. This would be part of your orientation packet, but this job description has terrific benefit for other administrators who are trying to understand what you're doing. So I called it out separately. I think it's also the one piece that the role holders tend to consult on a regular basis. The other type of last type of training you're using, if it's not happening casually in those monthly or biweekly status meetings, you are looking at the Data Cookbook content and evaluating the content. There's a audit trail. You can see what the users are doing in Data Cookbook and who is strong on their content and who might need some support. and you would personally reach out to folks whose work is not meeting standards and find out what they need to bring that content up to your standards. So the difference there between those two audiences is one is heavier on communication in a general sense and focuses in their environment contextually. The other user type is more training oriented. There is a high touch factor to it. For both of them, you set goals, and these are somewhat arbitrary, but they're helpful to, if you want to improve engagement, how are you going to measure it? It's not a feel-good thing, it's measurable. Set the volume of it and set the time frame of it. And there's only, I think, 3 areas. The login usage, the content itself, and then the speed with which content is approved. I think those are your 3 dials that you want to be monitoring. Some tools with this. I want to talk about the measuring. There's a lot in the cookbook right now that would need to be monitored manually. The users, the definitions, you do have a global count of the definitions there at the top of the page, but if you're trying to track what's the increase in definitions by functional area within the cookbook itself, you have to manually record your number every month and then go see what the new number is at the course of the next month. We do provide an ODBC connector that if you are in your data cookbook now, you can locate that underneath the organization tab in the settings area. These are 2 screenshots. The settings page is actually quite long. It starts out with this is the top of it, and you scroll down quite a bit. That's what this line stands for, is the scroll. And then towards the bottom, there's something called database access, ODBC access. So to invoke that, you would send a support ticket through the regular Data Cookbook support channels requesting ODBC access. And then the views that allow you, for those of you who don't know what ODBC is, it is a way for you to connect directly to the back end of your Data Cookbook to pull is the word I want, that's not that, query is the word I want, to query your own data content for these pertinent points of data. And you can, because you can control that through your SQL query, you can program it to say, what is my quota for this, what is my number for this functional area for definitions as of this date, and what has that changed since the last date. Anyway, clicking on, we offer several different views of your data, and in the settings area in the ODBC section, there is a link to that you can follow that takes you to this page in the public community, which will itemize the specific views that you can take advantage of through ODBC. I'll add each of these. We documented as a specification each of our views. So let's run through some scenarios. Let's pull it all together for a minute. So if I want to increase my consumers by 10%, my timeline might be, I think I can accomplish that in 6 months. Some tasks would be to track my current user login so that I have something to measure against. One way I'm going to increase that is by giving them more entry points. Maybe I have 10 API links now, and I'm going to move that up to 50. And then I'm going to see if I can get myself invited to at least 3 business units and talk about data governance. The collateral for that scenario would be, well, you need to get your login stats. You need to get your API embedded in 50 more links, 50 more reports. You have to write a sales presentation so that you have a script to say at these meetings. You need to sit down and articulate what the benefits would be in their terms, and then create a landing web page that they can visit after you leave to remind them of what they heard. It's just simply a marketing numbers game. The more people you reach out to and talk to, the more it's raising awareness. Your usage number will go up. Here's a screenshot of I showed you the Tableau report earlier. Here's a screenshot of an API within within a Cognos report specifically. You can see it's just a link. I did not use a button, and they labeled it just report and data definitions. Second scenario, again, it's pretty obvious, but just to increase my pool of definitions by 200. And I'll say I'm going to accomplish that in 3 months. I'm going to target 2 domains that are not well represented right now. I need to identify stewards. I need to train the stewards. And I need to incorporate the stewards into my pre-existing data steward program. Collateral to build that would be a packet for my orientation. Write down what is the role, what is the job description for a steward, and then have a standards document that articulates what the content standards are. I see commonly in clients that I implement, this is just how it is. They will onboard a group of stewards at the beginning, and those stewards will often participate in the training I provided in that initial conversation, and then so they receive a lot of information verbally and through the course of the project. But then if you want to onboard a year later more data stewards, they didn't go through that implementation plan. So it's at that point where you bring on that second wave of data stewards that you need to have a plan so that you can efficiently and effectively and strongly bring those people into the process. Casually having a conversation with them about, can you write some definitions, will not serve you well in the long term. So be prepared with that process. I think there's 3, you can do an orientation in 3 sessions. I would do 3. The first one is a meet and greet, just informational. Second one is they have their Data Cookbook account. They learn how to create content, what the standards are. And then the third one is a critique session. You may have more than one of these. You may repeat that critique session to solidify their skill set and give them confidence in their role. A job description sample of what a data steward does, summary, couple paragraphs, and then a list of specific tasks. Some samples of standards. This one, content standards, is just a simple bulleted list. It's actually published in Word. It's very simple. I think it's very old school. Second option for standards documentation is utilizing within Data Cookbook these little eyes, these help text blurbs. You can edit this blurb. You cannot change that text you see there, but you can put prefatory text or additional text at the bottom. And you can customize that with information that's relevant to your environment. So that's the second way you can document your standards. Third way, this is a credit. Nottingham is one of our clients. I have seen other clients do this, but this is their example of it. They take a definition, an actual definition, and they talk about the different components of it. They use the categorization method, and they just break out the different parts of the definition, and they label those parts as the formula for their data stewards to follow. I think it's an effective presentation. So I want to turn a little bit to why is it so hard? And it's been my observation that the analogies that I have come up with is if you are moving from a student system and you went from paper, which probably for most of us happened probably between 20 and 30 years ago, the first time you went from paper to your first automated system, that was probably a bit of a heavy lift. Today, you would be going from an existing automated system to a more modern system. And it's my understanding that Workday is structurally very different than our pre-existing, the architecture of the previous generation. So there is a bit of a learning curve to get from system A to system B, but probably less than to get from paper to the very first system. But I would argue through all three of these transitions, the thing that stayed the same was that we were still enrolling people, people were earning grades, people were earning degrees, there was a class, there were courses, there was room schedules to create, right? The process stayed the same across all of this, and everybody knew what the process was. You walk into a classroom, you do your homework, you get a grade, you earn a degree. Versus the analogy is in data governance and in using Data Cookbook, imagine that we didn't have any of the structure of enrollment. There was just people around and you could just randomly walk into a classroom and learn something, and there was no correlation of that class towards a degree, there was no grade, there was no structure. You could just wander around and attend class. Well, we do have those structures. And so right now your data is like this left-hand side, that there's no clear pathway or formula of how we use our data, why we use our data, what the rules are, how do we engage with each other around it. There's none of that with data right now. Little, none of it. I shouldn't say there's none of it. There's not enough. And we need to move towards a structured environment to where classes lead up to a major, which leads to a degree, which leads to graduation. So in both scenarios, you can have classrooms and students in the classrooms, but the one on the right has a much heavier infrastructure around it. And it's that infrastructure. I mean, the analogy is it could exist in both areas, but we're trying to put an infrastructure around your data, and that is brand new. That is not just going from system A to system B. The other analogy that is often made is around budgets and money, that you can't just do anything you want with money. There's a process, there's a budget process, there's protocols. Certain people can approve certain things, other people can't. And that's what we're trying to put those stops and measures and explanatory information around your data. I mean, imagine money without a budget. And right now, I think data governance is hard because we have our data without a strong structure. So it's not, as is so often in adult work, it's work that's just kind of repackaged. This is brand new work, brand new structures that you have to reach across departments and you have to reach across your institution. And that kind of work is almost unheard of in a work culture. It's very rare that brand new work comes along. There's also still, even though we're almost 15 years, 20 years into the data thing, there's still inexperience in our leaders, and that creates a tentativeness that when you have to scale across departments and across institutions, makes it very heavy.